Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the documentary Social Dilemma. This documentary premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival and was released on Netflix in September of 2020. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So this documentary, Social Dilemma, features interviews with a number of people who were connected to the development of social media platforms. For example, they had several people who worked for companies like Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. These interviews are woven in with this story featuring a family struggling with their social media usage, like a dramatization. The film is designed to sound the alarm about the dangers of social media. They implicate social media in a number of societal problems. For example, the propagation of misinformation, including the promotion of conspiracy theories, political polarization, mental health consequences. For example, they focused a lot on addiction, and they looked at anxiety and depression in girls. And the last area was data privacy and targeted advertising, including using the term surveillance capitalism. The overall message at the end was to be aware about the potential dangers of technology use, to consider reducing the amount of time on social media. Like many documentaries featured on Netflix, at first glance, they appear to make a good argument. But after digging in and looking at the research literature, the film appears less accurate. I think they did make a few good points though, so I'm going to point out the strengths and weaknesses for each of the 4 alleged consequences of social media use discussed in this documentary. The first consequence was misinformation. Social media allows the targeted transmission of vast quantities of information. Some of this information is false. Now, any specific user may get misinformation presented to them exclusively because at some point they may have expressed an interest in something like a conspiracy theory, which are often false. Now, what happens most of the time is people get both good and bad information. But even here, the person may not know how to tell the difference, or they may see misinformation first and start to believe that, so they discount good information. So this is an interesting claim that the documentary makes. Social media somehow caused or greatly contributed to this trend of misinformation. I think the truth is that social media makes spreading misinformation easier and more efficient, but the lack of critical thinking skills is the real problem. Many people have trouble discerning between legitimate and illegitimate sources of information. I think that social media technology has simply accelerated a problem that was already there. Conspiracy theories were everywhere before the internet, before widespread social media use. This technology is simply making it so that we have to face this problem. We need to address the critical thinking epidemic. Now moving to the second consequence, this was political polarization. For those who have been alive a long time, like me, it's very easy to see that many populations appear to be more polarized now than they were many years ago. We see this in the United States and in other places. If you take the struggle between Democrats and Republicans, for example, years ago during elections, people would mostly vote along party lines, but many tried to pick the person they thought would be a better leader. When they did cast a vote for whoever they chose, it didn't mean they actually hated the other person, and it didn't mean that they thought if their candidate lost, the world was going to fall apart. Nowadays, many people strongly identified with one side or the other, to the point where people who have opposing views are thought of as mortal enemies. They're not just co-workers, neighbors, and family members who have different opinions, rather some type of evil monster from outer space determined to destroy the planet. Now, I'm using hyperbole here, but ironically, the alien lizard people conspiracy theory essentially says this is literally true. So this is an interesting theory. What does the research literature tell us about political polarization? Well, policy differences between parties are not new. That's been going on for many years. Therefore, some level of polarization is not new. What is new is that each party has a larger activist base, which has become more sharply divided on various policies. Their presence has created an incentive for elected officials to adopt ideologically extreme positions. So here's a good analogy to how this works. Imagine you go to somewhere where a choir is performing. The choir may have, say, 25 people in it. One of those 25 singers is horrible, and they are the loudest singer. After hearing the choir sing, even though all the people were singing, you're left with a bad impression because the one bad singer really stood out. What if some people are politically polarized because they are only hearing the noisiest people? Now, under this theory, political polarization is still real, it's still happening, but social media isn't really to blame. Again, it is making it easier for people at the most extreme positions to be heard. Why is this the case? Why are these extreme voices being heard and other people not being heard? I think it really comes down to sensationalism. People with extreme views create drama, and with social media being driven by advertising, right? Advertisers want your attention. They have a better chance of getting it with these dramatic stories about activist behavior. Now moving to the third consequence, this is mental health problems. As I mentioned in the documentary, social media was responsible for several mental health problems, including girls being depressed, anxious, and suicidal. They showed what appears to be an impressive chart where the widespread use of social media coincided with an increase in symptoms. It's an interesting theory, but what does science tell us? Well, the reality here is that we just don't know for sure what's causing some of these symptoms to increase across various populations. We know a number of factors have a strong influence on these particular behaviors, like substance use. The evidence we have available now essentially indicates that social media can provide opportunities to help people with mental illness, and it can hurt them. The skill that smartphone users need to learn is not necessarily to set the phone down, it's to set boundaries. Social media allows another way for people to communicate, and whenever there is communication, there's a need for boundaries. What about the addiction aspect that was discussed? This is in the same category of mental health problems. In this documentary, we see the idea that social media use, particularly on smartphones, is really like gambling. There's this belief that reinforcement schedules cause this addiction. Now, a reinforcement schedule is when a reward is given according to some particular pattern. There are 4 basic reinforcement schedules: fixed interval, variable interval, fixed ratio, and variable ratio. Refreshing a social media site on a smartphone when looking for likes would be a variable ratio because the reinforcement is delivered after an unpredictable number of responses. A slot machine works the same way. No one knows how many times they're going to have to pull down the lever before they win. So the argument here is that slot machines cause addiction using that variable ratio reinforcement schedule. Therefore, the smartphones will get people addicted in the same way. Now, this is an interesting argument, but this reinforcement schedule is just one factor thought to contribute to the development of gambling addiction. It is not usually considered a major factor like a history of certain illnesses would be. For example, substance use, depression, anxiety, OCD, ADHD, and specific phobia. So it's just one part of a large puzzle. So looking at the reinforcement schedule and saying that's what's keeping people on smartphones, that's not really backed up by the evidence. The fourth consequence is data privacy and targeted advertising. This documentary paints this scary picture of how social media companies are collecting data and using it to target advertising. I agree with the documentary somewhat on this point. I do think the platforms need to be quite clear about what information they will collect and share. They need to provide specific instructions on how to protect personal information. The problem is not entirely with the social media companies, though. I think a lot of it is really like the owner's manual in a car. The first thing people are supposed to do after purchasing a new car is to read the owner's manual, but almost nobody does until there's a problem. Automobiles are complex. Social media is too. There's a lot at stake, so it's important to pay attention and to understand the different products that are being used. I think of it like this. If somebody had committed a serious crime at one time in their life, and they wanted to keep that information a secret, would they feel safe recording that confession on a social media site, regardless of what privacy protection they were promised? Probably not. If the data is never entered onto a site, nobody can retrieve it. Now, what about this controversy around the social media sites trying to figure out the 5-factor model of different people. So figuring out people's personalities. Well, the big 5 traits explain behavior tendencies. It's not like a mental health diagnosis or something like that. If social media companies want to try to figure out people's personality profiles, I don't really see how that can be prevented. There are actually a number of different metrics they can attempt to measure outside of personality, like height, weight, and age. I don't necessarily worry too much about them making guesses on personality traits. Now, as far as the targeted advertising piece, I know a number of people are unhappy with this type of advertising, but in a way, it's really just companies trying to get in front of people they think are interested in their products and services. I actually think this makes a lot of sense because it doesn't waste advertisers' money putting an ad in front of somebody who is probably not interested. In one sense, somebody complaining about targeting advertising is really saying, how dare these companies show me exactly what I want to buy? So that was my review of the theories put forth in the documentary. I want to cover a few other points about this film. I find it funny that many of the people who were interviewed in the film expressed shock at the direction that social media is going. Even though they were sort of part of the problem, it's like they were saying, I can't believe how incompetent I was. Or it's like they're saying, I designed this killer robot, and now I feel really badly about how dangerous it is. We should have never given the robot a rocket launcher. This film is really presenting a new version of moral panic. We know that many inventions drew suspicion and contempt when they were new. For example, the bicycle, the telephone, the radio, and books. Nowadays, not many people think that their Schwinn 10-speed is going to destroy the entire planet. Perhaps social media is illuminating people's choices. People choose to use social media, they feel guilty about what they're doing, so they blame the social media platforms. Similar to the blame the liquor store model of alcoholism. Now, I understand the theory behind that model, but does personal responsibility not play any role? If there is a villain here, it is the one that social media has unlocked inside of people who use it for evil. Social media can take everything bad about human behavior and spread it quickly to more people. It is an accelerant, among other things. Is social media really out of control, like in the movie The Terminator? This advanced AI was created and people lost control over it? Or is it just exposing the lack of control that many people already exhibit? To use another car analogy, the expansion of social media is like if these incredibly fast cars were manufactured and sold. Most people would probably drive those cars just as they would a normal vehicle. But some people would push them right to the limit and run them into telephone poles. It only takes a few people like that to make other people believe that everyone is driving into telephone poles. The documentary highlights the desperate attempt to identify what's going on. Why are things seemingly so bad? So people want answers, and social media is now the villain that people are going to blame. Social media is just a tool. We need to use the tool in a way that promotes well-being and avoid using it in ways that cause destruction. So those are my thoughts on the documentary Social Dilemma. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis on this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.